The first time it happened, I was 17 years old, lying perfectly still in my own bed while listening to the sound of another person breathing beside me. The room was dark. The house was quiet. My parents were asleep down the hall. My younger sisters were sleeping in the next room. Everything should have felt familiar. Everything should have felt safe. Instead, my heart was pounding so hard that I was convinced the boy beside me could hear it. I remember staring at the ceiling and waiting for something that never came. An explanation, a warning, a conversation, anything. Nobody had told me what I was supposed to do. Nobody had told me what I was supposed to feel. Nobody had explained what happened when two young people, raised in silence, suddenly found themselves alone together in the dark. I had agreed to this because it was normal, because this was how things were done, because everyone around me treated it like the most natural thing in the world. But lying there that night, I felt completely unprepared. Looking back now, I realized that was the real story, not the boy, not the bed, not even the tradition itself. The real story was how much we were expected to navigate without ever being given the tools to understand it. My name is Martha. I grew up Old Order Amish in eastern Ohio. For most of my life, there were two versions of reality. There was the version outsiders saw, the horses, the buggies, the handmade quilts, the peaceful farms, the smiling families, the simple life. Then there was the version we lived, the version that existed behind closed doors, the version people rarely discussed, the version filled with questions nobody wanted to answer. This is one of those stories. Most people who hear the word bundling imagine something innocent, almost charming, a curious tradition from another century, something sweet, something harmless. That is exactly how it was presented to us. The older women described it with soft smiles and knowing looks. The men rarely spoke about it at all. The official explanation sounded simple enough. A young man and a young woman spend time together in a private setting. They talk. They get to know each other. They build emotional intimacy before marriage. They remain respectful. They remain disciplined. They remain fully clothed. It was presented as a beautiful balance between courtship and restraint, a tradition built on trust, a tradition built on faith, a tradition built on self-control. That was the story, but there was another reality nobody discussed. Nobody talked about what happened when teenagers who knew almost nothing about their own bodies suddenly found themselves inches away from someone they found attractive. Nobody talked about curiosity. Nobody talked about longing. Nobody talked about confusion. Nobody talked about the fact that human emotions do not disappear simply because nobody mentions them. We were expected to act as though desire didn't exist, as though attraction could be switched off through sheer determination, as though silence itself was a form of protection. But silence does not educate. Silence does not prepare. Silence only leaves people alone with questions. The first boy who came to see me was named Ezra. He was 19 years old. Everyone liked him. Parents trusted him. Church leaders approved of him. He had a reputation for being steady, responsible, dependable, the kind of young man every family hoped their daughter might marry. I remember hearing his footsteps before I saw him. I remember the nervous feeling that settled into my stomach. I remember wondering whether he was as uncomfortable as I was. When he appeared in the doorway, he hesitated. Just for a moment, it was enough to make me feel slightly less alone. At least one of us seemed nervous. He crossed the room carefully and sat down. For several minutes, neither of us knew what to say. Then the conversation started. Slowly, awkwardly. The weather, church, farming, his horse, my father's fields, the singing service from the previous Sunday. Safe topics, predictable topics, the kind of things people discuss when neither person knows how to talk about what they are actually feeling. Hours passed that way, words filling space while bigger thoughts remained unspoken. At one point, his arm rested lightly against mine, a tiny movement, barely noticeable, yet it felt enormous. My entire body became aware of that single point of contact. I didn't move. I didn't pull away. I didn't move closer. I simply froze. I was terrified of making the wrong choice, terrified of misunderstanding the situation, terrified of revealing feelings I didn't understand myself. Eventually, he fell asleep. That surprised me. I hadn't expected sleep to be possible. My own mind was racing too fast. For over an hour, I listened to his breathing, steady, calm, peaceful, while my thoughts moved in circles. Is this normal? Am I doing this correctly? What is supposed to happen? What is everyone else feeling during these moments? Nobody had given me answers. Nobody had given me language. So I lay there alone with uncertainty. Ezra visited 2 more times. Each visit felt slightly easier than the one before. The distance between us became smaller, not physically, emotionally. We started sharing things that mattered: dreams, fears, private thoughts. One night he admitted he wasn't sure he wanted the future everyone expected him to have. Another night I admitted that sometimes I dreamed about places beyond Ohio, places I had never seen, lives I couldn't quite imagine, possibilities that felt both exciting and frightening. He listened, really listened. That mattered more than I realized at the time. For a brief period, I thought something might develop between us. Then he stopped coming. No explanation, no goodbye, just silence. A few weeks later, I heard he was courting another girl in a neighboring district. The news surprised me, not because I was heartbroken, but because I wasn't. Mostly, I felt relief. Relief that I no longer had to pretend I understood a process that confused me. Relief that the pressure had disappeared. Relief that I no longer had to lie awake wondering whether I was doing everything wrong. Then Caleb arrived, and everything changed. Some people carry uncertainty into a room. Caleb carried confidence. The difference was obvious immediately. He didn't hesitate at the doorway. He didn't seem nervous. He didn't appear worried about saying the wrong thing. He walked in like someone who had already done this dozens of times before. The girls talked about him, never openly, never directly, but enough rumors existed to create an image: experienced, charming, popular, the kind of young man who knew exactly how to make girls like him. When he sat beside me, I felt something immediately: pressure. Not spoken pressure, not visible pressure, but pressure all the same, a feeling that events were moving faster than I could process them. The conversation flowed easily, too easily. He always seemed to know exactly what to say, exactly when to smile, exactly how to make someone feel special. At first it was exciting, then it became overwhelming, because beneath the excitement was something else: confusion. I had never experienced that kind of attention before, never experienced someone looking at me with that level of certainty, never experienced feelings arriving faster than my understanding could keep up. When he kissed me, the experience shocked me, not because it happened, but because of what I felt afterward: a flood of emotions, questions, curiosity, fear, excitement, guilt, all arriving at the same time. No one had ever explained any of it. No one had ever prepared me for the complexity of being human. I had spent my entire life learning rules, but nobody had taught me how to understand feelings. And feelings don't disappear simply because rules exist. That was the lesson nobody talked about, the lesson nobody acknowledged, the lesson young people were expected to discover alone. When things moved beyond what I was comfortable with, I told him to stop. The first time, he paused. The second time, I said it more firmly. Eventually, he listened. But what stayed with me wasn't the moment itself. It was what happened afterward. I lay awake for hours, alone, confused, trying to make sense of emotions I didn't have names for, trying to determine whether I had done something wrong, trying to figure out why I felt guilty for feelings that had appeared without my permission. By morning, I had convinced myself the problem was me. Years later, I would learn how common that reaction was. When people lack information, they often blame themselves. When people lack education, they often assume confusion is a personal failure. When people are taught silence instead of understanding, shame fills the empty space. At 17, I didn't know that. All I knew was that I felt broken. And I wasn't the only one. Every girl I knew carried some version of the same secret. Different stories, different experiences, different consequences, but the same silence, the same confusion, the same feeling of navigating unfamiliar territory without a map. Looking back now, I realize that was never a failure of character. It was a failure of preparation, and that realization would change everything I believed about the world I had been raised in. The third boy was named Jonas. Even now, years later, I can still remember the first thing I noticed about him. It wasn't his appearance, it wasn't his confidence, it wasn't the way he spoke. It was the fact that he arrived carrying something in his hand. No one else had done that. As he stepped into the room, he held out a small, carved wooden bird. Simple, smooth, carefully made. The kind of object that only comes from hours of patience. "I made it for you," he said. I turned it over in my hands, feeling every detail carved into the wood. "It's a wren," I smiled. "It mates for life." Something shifted inside me. Not excitement, not nervousness, recognition. For the first time, I felt like someone wasn't trying to impress me. He was trying to know me. That difference mattered more than I understood at the time. When Jonas lay down beside me, he kept his distance. Not because he was afraid, not because he was unsure, but because he respected it. That distinction changed everything. The conversation that night felt different from every conversation I had experienced before. Instead of talking about chores, weather, and church activities, he talked about fears, real fears, the kind people rarely admit out loud. He told me he worried about becoming his father. Not because his father was a bad man, quite the opposite. His father was respected throughout the community, hardworking, faithful, dependable, but emotionally distant, closed off, the kind of man who carried every burden alone. Jonas feared becoming someone who spent his entire life present physically, but absent emotionally. I remember being surprised by his honesty. People weren't supposed to talk that way, at least not where we came from. Vulnerability wasn't encouraged. Questions weren't encouraged. Doubt certainly wasn't encouraged. Yet there he was, speaking openly about thoughts most people spent years hiding. Then he admitted something even more surprising. Sometimes he had doubts. Not about God, not about faith, about himself, about his future, about whether the life planned for him was truly the life he wanted. I remember staring into the darkness after he said those words, because for the first time, I realized I wasn't alone. I had doubts too, questions too, dreams I couldn't explain, feelings I couldn't name, longings that seemed to exist beyond the borders of the world I had been given. For hours we talked, really talked, not performing, not pretending, not repeating approved answers, just two people telling the truth. When he eventually reached for my hand, it felt more intimate than anything I had experienced before, not because of physical closeness, because of emotional safety. That was the difference. For the first time, I felt understood. Over the months that followed, our relationship grew slowly, carefully, deliberately. Neither of us rushed. Neither of us pretended to know everything. We simply learned each other, conversation by conversation, night by night, question by question. Trust wasn't built through grand gestures. It was built through consistency, through honesty, through showing up. Eventually, we fell in love. At least, what I believed love was at the time. When Jonas asked my father for permission to marry me, I said yes, without hesitation, without doubt. I genuinely believed we were building something strong. And in many ways, we were. The problem wasn't that we loved each other. The problem was that love alone cannot compensate for missing knowledge. Love cannot replace communication skills that were never taught. Love cannot replace emotional education that never existed. Love cannot magically solve problems nobody knows how to discuss. We entered marriage carrying enormous blind spots. Neither of us realized it. Neither of us understood how much we didn't know. We had been taught how to work, how to obey, how to endure, but not how to communicate, not how to navigate conflict, not how to discuss needs, not how to understand ourselves. And eventually, those missing pieces began to matter. At first, the cracks were small, misunderstandings, unspoken expectations, conversations avoided because neither of us knew how to have them. Then the cracks widened. Months became years. Frustrations became resentments. Silence became distance. Looking back now, I don't think our marriage failed because we were incompatible. I think it struggled because we entered adulthood without tools. Imagine trying to build a house without being given a hammer, then being blamed when the structure collapses. That is what it felt like. The older I became, the more questions surfaced, questions I had spent years pushing aside, questions that refused to disappear. Why was curiosity treated like rebellion? Why was silence treated like wisdom? Why were young people expected to navigate complicated emotional realities completely alone? Why did nobody explain anything? The answers never came, at least not from the people I expected. Instead, the pressure continued building until eventually I reached a breaking point. When I left the Amish community, I was 23 years old. People often ask whether I was terrified. The truth is more complicated. I was terrified and relieved at the same time. Terrified because I was leaving everything I had ever known. Relieved because for the first time in my life, I could ask questions without feeling guilty. Leaving wasn't one dramatic moment. It wasn't a movie scene. It was 1,000 painful moments stacked on top of one another. Conversations that ended badly. Relationships that became strained. Silences that grew longer. Doors that slowly closed. Then came the shunning. That is the part people rarely understand. Most people imagine losing a community. What they don't imagine is losing pieces of your identity. People you love suddenly speaking less, then less again, then not at all. Phone calls ending quickly, letters unanswered. Relationships becoming ghosts while the people themselves are still alive. The hardest part wasn't the anger. It was the absence, the emptiness, the feeling of reaching toward someone and finding nothing there. I carried that pain for years. Some days I still do. Eventually, I found myself sitting in a therapist's office in Columbus. I didn't know it then, but those conversations would change my life. For the first time, someone encouraged me to talk openly, not perform, not explain myself, not defend myself. Just talk. And as I talked, something strange happened. I started learning words I had never been given. Autonomy, boundaries, consent, emotional regulation, healthy communication, desire, not as something shameful, not as something dangerous, simply as part of being human. The realization was overwhelming. For years, I had viewed so many experiences through the lens of guilt. Now I was seeing them through the lens of understanding. The difference was enormous. One day, my therapist said something I have never forgotten. She looked at me and said, "You were expected to solve problems without being given the tools to solve them." I sat there quietly, because suddenly everything made sense. The confusion, the fear, the shame, the constant feeling that I was failing some invisible test. It wasn't that I lacked character. It wasn't that I lacked faith. I lacked information. I lacked preparation. I lacked guidance. No one had shown me the tools. Then I realized something even more painful. Most of the people around me hadn't been shown those tools either. The women before me, the men before me, the generations before us. Many of them were struggling with the exact same gaps, the exact same silence, the exact same unanswered questions. Suddenly my story felt bigger than me. It wasn't just about bundling. It wasn't just about marriage. It wasn't even just about the Amish community. It was about what happens whenever people are denied knowledge and then blamed for struggling. It happens everywhere, in different forms, in different cultures, in different families. Silence creates confusion. Confusion creates shame. And shame convinces people they are broken. They aren't broken. They're uninformed. There's a difference, a very important difference. Today, when I think back to that 17-year-old girl lying awake in the darkness beside a boy she barely knew, my heart breaks for her. Not because she made mistakes, not because she was confused, not because she was human. My heart breaks because she thought she was alone. She thought everyone else had answers she didn't have. She thought uncertainty was weakness. She thought confusion was failure. She thought asking questions was dangerous.
She was wrong. Questions are not dangerous. Questions are how people grow. Questions are how people learn. Questions are how people protect themselves. And if there is one thing I wish I could tell that younger version of myself, it would be this. There is nothing wrong with wanting to understand yourself. There is nothing wrong with needing information. There is nothing wrong with asking why. The people who benefit from silence will always try to convince you otherwise. But growth begins where silence ends. If you grew up feeling unprepared for the most important moments of your life, I see you. If you were expected to navigate adulthood without guidance, I see you. If you spent years believing your confusion meant something was wrong with you, I see you. You were never supposed to figure everything out alone. No one is. Human beings learn through conversation, through education, through support, through honesty, not through silence. Never through silence. And that is the lesson I carried with me when I walked away from the life I once believed would last forever. The questions deserved answers. They always did. The truth deserved a voice. It always did. And sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is stop accepting silence as wisdom and start asking the questions that should have been answered all along. That is what finally changed my life. And it might change yours too.